Good morning, everybody. My name is Gill Westaway. I'm a familiar face here at the Ubud Writers Festival and delighted to be moderating the first session of the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival 24 in Alang Alang. So we're very happy to be joined this morning by Sathnam Sanghera, who is a British Indian or Indian British journalist, much awarded, and his recent claim to fame is a very good book. Just as a matter of interest, has anybody read Empireworld, How British Imperialism Shaped the Globe?
We've got a few readers.
A few, a scattering. Well, I would say after this session, go out and buy it. It's a splendid book and very entertaining as well as informative. So go for it. So, Sathnam, I'm going to go straight into the thick of it. And in your book, towards the end of your book, you read out a challenge. It's time to abandon this monochromatic way of seeing our imperial history once and for all. It's time to seek nuance wherever it's available. It's time for everyone, even those of us who think we know a lot, to challenge what we thought we knew and to be open to changing our minds. Most importantly, it's finally time to turn Britain's hoary old monologue on the British Empire into a real dialogue. And that's really what lies at the heart of your book. Can you talk to us about that challenge?
Yeah, I guess, I'm writing about history, but none of this is really a history in that, none of us would be here in this room today if it wasn't for European colonialism. Bali wouldn't be what it is. I wouldn't be a child of Indian immigrants growing up in Britain if the British Empire had never existed. And also, reading the news this morning, so much of it relates to that history. So we've got, I don't know if you've caught up with the BBC News app today, we've got Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, saying he's refusing to talk about reparations when it comes to slavery. You've got, Prince Charles, King Charles in Australia facing all these protests in relation to the First Nations people. You've got actually Donald Trump complaining about British interference in American politics, and that goes back to the fact that the Americans rejected the British Empire, and it goes down very well in America. We're bombing the Yemen in a way we were 100 years ago. Israel-Palestine is a situation we created more than a century ago. We could carry on. Situation in Nigeria, Sudan, Myanmar, Iraq, all these things can be explained to a large degree by the history of the British Empire. And yet in Britain, we don't really talk about the British Empire. If we do, we talk about it in a very basic way. Or we say, like Keir Starmer, we don't want to talk about it. So I don't think this is a constructive way to talk about these issues. We need to be more nuanced and constructive. That's my argument.
Right, and you make it very persuasively in your book. Do you think that as of 2024, you look at the way that British people are conceiving empire, is it a monologue, or has this dialogue already begun?
It's a very reluctant dialogue. I mean, interestingly, I don't know, you guys are probably aware of the Commonwealth, which is this kind of agency that the British created at the end of empire to pretend that empire had never happened. And it's a kind of collection of post-imperial countries. We have these kind of games every 4 years. My friend John Oliver, the comedian, described the Commonwealth Games as a kind of off-Broadway Olympics. And the Commonwealth is kind of off-Broadway United Nations. But what does it do? What does it mean? It's not something we've really managed to give meaning to. When India joined the Commonwealth, Nehru joined on the grounds that he sold it to his colleagues on the grounds that we might as well join because it doesn't mean anything anyway. But it's created this dissonance. So in Britain, we act like the empire never happened. But when we do talk about empire, it's in a very basic way of kind of arguing that you can reduce it to pros and cons, and overall, the the pros outweigh the cons. You've probably come across that argument if you watched BBC TV and watched Michael Portillo on his train programs. And it's the way we've always talked about empire. It's the way we talked about empire when it was happening. In that politicians would say, well, overall, it costs us this much and it's worthwhile carrying on, or not. But it's not a very logical way to talk about a very complex history, because how do you weigh the fact that, we built some railways in India against the fact that up to 2 million people had died in partition? How do you weigh up the fact that we created Nigeria against the fact that, hundreds of thousands of people died in the civil war that happened after we created Nigeria? And I think this way of balancing pros and cons doesn't really make sense. It's like comparing apples and pears. It's much better to look at the contradictions of empire and look at them as discrete phenomena.
You talk a lot in your book, and you've referenced that now, for the need for nuance and balance in the dialogue. But I've also heard you say that the enemy of nuance and balance is social media.
Yeah, I just think we're in a world where, I go around saying, the British Empire wasn't good or bad. It was simultaneously both things. It involved environmental destruction, but then British imperialists were hugely involved in creating environmentalism. It resulted in the spread of democracy in a whole bunch of places. It also resulted in geopolitical chaos. But opposite things can be true at the same time. So I spend my time saying that. And I think fundamentally that's what historians are interested in. It's a nuance. But the world doesn't want to hear that. We're in a world of social media where we're all in our echo chambers, where algorithms repeat our views back to us, but in more extreme forms. It's because everything's become like a football match where you have your side and then there's the enemy, and the enemy is to be hated. And unfortunately, politics is becoming like that too. So there's very few people in British politics or American politics who say, this is what I believe, but I also respect the other side's point of view. You don't hear that at all now. You just hear entrenchment and extremism. And I just think those of us who write and those of us who read books have to make the case for nuance, because that's what books are about. But I do feel like fewer and fewer people are reading books, and I feel like it's a very lonely place to argue for nuance and contradiction.
You talk about the need, particularly post-Brexit, for Britain to acknowledge what it did in the world, or to the world, as it goes into negotiation on new trade agreements and this kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think the point in time in which we find ourselves now, post-Brexit, is particularly important.
Yeah, Britain's a very interesting country because we do go out in the world and we pontificate. We're always lecturing the world, you might have noticed, about human rights and democracy, and also we're trying to get new trade deals because we shot ourselves in our face with Brexit. But when we go around the world, I think there's very little sense that we've been there before. We don't remember what happened, but the world does. The world remembers what happened the last time the British turned up on boats asking for trade, and it's this really odd dissonance. And, when it comes to things like democracy, and we're always lecturing the world, we need to reflect upon the fact that we have very questionable records in terms of democracy. Even the places that ended up with democracy, like Australia and Hong Kong, well, not Hong Kong, but Nigeria or India, we did not encourage democracy in India when we were in charge of India. Even at the late stage of the empire in India, we were resisting giving the Indians democracy or any say in their country. And now we're forever lecturing them. So I think we really need to be aware of what we did, because the world remembers. And for me, the best illustration of this is Tony Blair in his biography, when he's talking about handing back Hong Kong to the Chinese. And he says, I was only dimly aware of the history, which I find shocking, because you can bet every Chinese person, every Hong Kong person knows about the Opium Wars. They know about how Hong Kong came about. They know about the Century of Humiliation. It's on the curriculum in China. And the British Prime Minister has no awareness of the history. And I think that's quite typical of British people who go around quite obliviously as to what they did. And I think it's also not uncommon for other European colonizers to do the same.
Do you want to talk about the context of Indonesia with the Dutch at this point, or should we?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's very interesting because, we have a severe case of imperial nostalgia in Britain, but there was a survey done of the European former colonial powers, and actually we weren't the most nostalgic former colonial power. The most nostalgic is actually the Netherlands, because they were even smaller than us, and arguably they achieved even more. And actually the British Empire, the East India Company, was attempting to copy what the Dutch East India Company was already doing in this part of the world. And you can see why the Dutch are so nostalgic. And so I don't think we're alone in our curious feelings about empire. And arguably, the Russians have an even bigger problem. The reason they've invaded Ukraine is because they're nostalgic about the Russian Empire. So I don't think it's a uniquely British problem, but it's a particular British problem because the British Empire was the biggest empire in the history of the world. And so the legacies are more present and more part of the daily news than perhaps for the Dutch.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago contradictions and the futility of trying to sort of do a balance sheet with the good and the bad. And you talk about the fact that you believe that Britain today is still one of the most successful multiracial countries on earth, but it's also a country with huge problems of racism.
Yeah, I mean, this is something British politicians and the British media and social media can't handle, because there's a narrative in Britain that we are post-racism, that, I think a lot of it's got to do with World War II. Our national narrative is that we beat the evil racist Germans.
Right.
And also the Americans came and helped us, and they were really mean to their black soldiers, and we were nice to them. And, racism is really a problem in America, and slavery was really happening in America. We weren't really involved in it. Obviously, the story is not quite like that, in that the British sent 3 million Africans across the Atlantic. A lot of racist ideas that exist in America and around the world, the British helped to create. Modern racism and scientific racism, when it emerged in the 19th century, this weird idea that certain races were born more intelligent or stronger than others, was largely a British creation. And also, we have a distinct history of British fascism and racial violence, which goes back to there were racist riots in Britain in 1919, and there were racist riots this year. Yes. And there's a link between that. But Britain can't handle that. The British politicians can't handle the idea that we've had a brown British Prime Minister. We are in many ways very successful as a multicultural nation, but at the same time we have a history of racism and continue to have a problem with it. Opposite things can be true at the same time, but you very rarely hear that said.
Getting personal for a moment, I believe that you've been the butt of a lot of racial abuse for this book and maybe the one before, Empireland.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I'm not alone in this, in that, there are lots of imperial historians. One of them much more successful than me, David Olusoga. You might have seen some of his BBC programs. He's a black historian. He talks generally about all of British history, but also he's black and he writes about black history. But, he can't, at events like this, he has a bodyguard, in Britain. I stopped doing events in Britain because I had so much racist abuse and anger directed at me. I had to come off social media, death threats, all the usual. And actually, I'm not offering a particularly radical message. I'm often saying that opposite things can be true at the same time, trying to offer a message of nuance. But for a lot of British people, for certain type of British person, and they're not always white, sometimes actually they are Sri Lankan, Indian, and so on, for them, their identity is tied up with the idea that the British Empire was great. And if you present any kind of alternative narrative, you are criticizing Britain. It's such a dangerous thing. And again, a lot of countries have this problem. They can't handle any kind of criticism. And there's an idea that if you want to be proud of being British, you need to be proud of British history. And I always say, well, British history was quite long. What are you proud of? Are you proud of the Great Potato Famine in Ireland? Or are you proud of the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland? Because we did both. Are you proud of our history in slavery? Because we were deeply involved in slavery. Or are you proud of the fact that we abolished slavery? Because we did both things, right?
So again, there's these inherent contradictions.
Yeah. So what does it mean? It's like saying, I'm proud of the British weather. Because it's not... but people they go around saying, I'm proud of British history. It's such a strange thing to say. But it's quite a common view. And a lot of British politicians say it too. I mean, a lot of conservative politicians say it. Rishi Sunak, the other day, when he was Prime Minister, was saying, we need to stop unpicking history. And that's what historians do. They unpick history. We are arguing about what happened in the Stone Age. We are changing our views about what the Romans did. So why would we not change our views of what happened in British Empire? And our view of British Empire has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years because finally we're getting the point of view of the people who were colonized and not just the colonizer's point of view. But I guess you are always going to get, tension because it's tied up with people's sense of identity and pride and family, because so many people had families who were involved in the British Empire, both me, like in terms of the colonized, also the colonizers. I don't know if you did.
Don't think I did. I mean, Aussies, I suppose, yeah.
Are you Aussie?
Yeah.
I managed to have a whole conversation without you,
No,
without picking that up.
I'm a mongrel.
But you...
I'm English and Australian.
Oh, okay, well that happens
Two
quite a lot.
passports. Yeah.
It's allowed.
Yep. Maybe we'll come back to some of the more obvious topics like slavery and indentured labour. But I think one of the topics that surprises people in your book is when you assert that the British Empire transformed large parts of the planet through plants.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that?
As did the Dutch, again.
Exactly, yes.
We would not be here if the British and the Dutch weren't very keen on spices and nutmeg. And, people argue about when the British Empire began, but I think it pretty much began not far from here on the island of Run in the Banda Islands when the Dutch and the British started arguing about nutmeg. And it all goes back to the fact that Dutch and British food was very bad. And they were desperate to make it more interesting with nutmeg and other kinds of spices. So we ended up actually fighting with the Dutch over the island of Run. And there's a tiny spice which you could buy on Run for, say, £1 and sell in Britain for 600 times the price. You could buy a house with a few nutmegs. And so the idea that plants were involved in colonialism, we've kind of lost that connection with the idea that plants could be technology, but the whole of colonialism was tied up with plants. So it wasn't just nutmeg, tea and coffee. The British changed the shape of the world because of tea. We ended up going to war with the Chinese, selling them opium in return for tea. We changed the diet of the Irish and the Indians and the English with tea because it was very profitable for the English to sell people tea. There's an idea now that Indians have always been drinking tea, but actually in 1900, Indians were barely drinking any tea. If they're now drinking lots of tea, it's because the British realized they could make a lot of money from making them drink tea. And then we had to set up the plantations, change the shape of the world. But then we've got other crops. We've got cinchona, which is the bark from which you make quinine.
Quinine, yeah.
And quinine is the chemical that allowed white people and other kind of people to survive the worst effects of malaria. And it's because of quinine, which had been discovered by South Americans, that the European colonizers were able to colonize Africa. Before that, they would get there and die generally within 3 months. And so this plant changed the shape of Africa. You could go on, and there's so, I mean, rubber. I mean, the rubber has changed the shape of this part of the world too. I mean, Malaysia. There's actually very little awareness in Britain that we were ever involved in Malaysia. We talk about India, we talk about America, we talk about South Africa. People don't talk about the Malayan emergency of 1948. You know, where we set upon a war with the Malayans to hold on to rubber plantations because they were so profitable. And it's one of the darkest episodes in the history of the British Empire. And do you know why it was called I'm testing you on my book here, why it was called the 1948 Malayan emergency and not a war?
Nope.
It's in a footnote, so you're forgiven.
Yeah, no, I didn't read them. By the way, half his book is footnotes.
Yeah, well, that's because...
I mean, he's showing off all the research he
that's
did.
because people keep on questioning. People suggest I'm making stuff
Yeah.
up. But
So
it was,
I have to admit, I didn't read the footnotes.
it was called the Malayan emergency for insurance reasons. Because if it was a war, then you wouldn't have got the insurance payouts. And also, using the phrase emergency allows the British to pretend it didn't happen. And that's one of the many reasons we've forgotten that we embarked on this horrible war where where villages were burnt en masse, and one of the worst things to happen in the British Empire happened. And but yeah, so plants were hugely involved in the British Empire. And also, you know, behind you, you've got a fern. British homes are full of ferns. Ferns came from places like Australia and Southeast Asia, and it led to fern mania in the Victorian age, where British people were obsessed with decorating their homes. And people have forgotten that most of the plants in British gardens come from Empire or America or other places, so rhododendrons, azaleas. So things that have become very British were actually never really British.
Mm. Yeah.
Including Australia.
Indeed, and there'll be many people in the audience who associate with that. Talk to us a little bit then about the role of slavery in the whole empire influence, and indeed the difference between slavery and indentured labour.
Yeah, I mean, there is a view. I was taught about slavery at school. Somehow, it was never mentioned that the British were involved. We just talked about American slavery. And because Americans are quite good at talking about it, I guess, better than British, they make films about it. And there's an idea that slavery is something the Americans did. And actually, no, the British were at the forefront, not the originators. The Dutch were, and the Portuguese were more heavily into it than us. But we did send 3 million Africans across the Atlantic. Of those 3 millions, the company that sent the most was the Royal African Company. And that was a company run for the royal family. It was chaired at times from royal palaces. The Whitehall Palace, which no longer exists, King James was often chairing these meetings. When the enslaved were sent across the Atlantic by the Royal African Company, they arrived in places like Barbados. They would have the initials of the Duke of York or the Royal African Company branded into their skin. And this is something, again, we've only just begun to understood. And there are now calls for the royal family to pay reparations because they made quite a lot of money out of it. And it's a sign of how involved we were that when we abolished slavery, we paid 40% of the national budget in 1 year to compensate not the enslaved, but slave owners. It was a huge part of our economy. And again, it's only in recent days we've begun to understand this. But when you go to places like Barbados and Jamaica and so on, it's very well understood. They live daily with the consequences of it. And I mean, one example is the healthcare sector. We never allowed the enslaved to have healthcare. And then when we left, we didn't really give them any money to set up healthcare systems, which is bad enough. But now we still go to that part of the world and poach their best healthcare workers to staff the NHS. So not only are we ignorant about what we did, we then make it even worse. And then on top of that, we have the British Prime Minister today saying we are not going to engage in a conversation about reparations. So it's misery upon ignorance upon misery upon ignorance. And then on top of that, when we got rid of slavery, we set up a system of indenture where, we sent 1 million Indians around the world to take the place of the enslaved in places like Ghana, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on. it wasn't as bad as slavery. We paid those workers, but very poorly. They're often living in the same quarters as the enslaved. They're often punished in the same way. And eventually we abolished that system for similar reasons. But one of the main reasons today that wherever you go in the world you meet Indians is because of indentured labor. One of the main reasons you go anywhere you go in the world you see British people is because of the British Empire, because the British people were so good at traveling, and they continue to be good at traveling. And I think Australia, for similar reason, that you have so many Australians around the world, goes back to that history of travel and sending prisoners to Australia and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
How does the current king feel about reparations? Our King Charles.
Oh, that's a really good question, because our governments, even the new government, left-wing government, are in complete denial and don't want to talk about it and try to shut down the conversation. My sense from actually talking to members of the royal household is they are much more engaged, and they have to be, because first of all, King Charles is the head of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth are always trying to talk about this. Interesting, the 3 candidates to head the Commonwealth, all of them believe in reparations. So King Charles sees this. He saw it in his trip to Australia, he saw it in his trip to Kenya. It's a constant conversation in the royal sphere. Also, he's the head of a multicultural nation beyond politics. So he also represents a multicultural nation. So he has to think about it. And I've heard that actually, the Church of England are paying reparations. They're paying £100 million, possibly up to £1 billion soon. And I've heard that the royal family actually want to be part of that process, but they are prevented from being so by the politicians who have their head in the sand. And I would say the politicians are prevented from talking about it by our very right-wing media, who will not ever tolerate any kind of conversation about this. And I say this as a member of the right-wing media. Yeah.
A thorn in their side, I no doubt, at times.
They let me, I write for the Times and I've never been censored, but equally they don't encourage me to talk about this stuff. Well, that's harsh, but, they have a certain view, which is not my view.
Right. Another interesting chapter in your book looks at the influence of British laws on former colonial countries, and you start off the chapter by looking at the influence on laws governing same-sex relationships.
Yeah, it's quite an odd thing that the majority of anti-gay legislation in the world that exists in places like India, Uganda, loads of African countries, Southeast Asia even, comes from the British Empire, copied directly from the penal code of India. And you end up with a very contradictory state of affairs. So Britain now, very enlightened, it goes around the world saying that, we should tolerate gay people, we should be equal, give equal rights to gay people. And yet, a lot of the homophobic legislation exists because we gave it to people. And now you have African politicians hating the fact that the British lectured them about gay rights. And yet, they have British imperial legislation reinforcing their own homophobia. So it's really contradictory state of affairs. And you have the same with the quite repressive colonial sedition laws and the way in which post-colonial police behave. Often the way in which post-colonial police behave very badly in India and so on, they're following the tradition of colonial police. So even when they become independent, they've rejected a lot of colonialism, but they've happily embraced the repressive side of it. And they are using the stuff that they fought to fight their own people. So it's so contradictory.
Bureaucracy as well.
Yeah, bureaucracy is something that's been embraced by the Indians especially, and now we're obsessed with getting rid of red tape in Britain, and yet we were the creators of red tape, which has now been embraced by Indians and many, many other countries.
Okay. Again, let's go back, find one final look at contradictions, and you say the greatest contradiction of all is when it comes to facing up to the legacies of British Empire. It both instilled chaos and spread democracy.
Yeah, There's a great book about this, actually written by a right-wing politician called Kwasi Kwarteng. Anyone know who he is? He was involved in the disastrous Liz Truss government. And he wrote one of the angriest books I've ever read about British Empire. It doesn't fit in with the fact that his party then have launched a culture war praising the empire. He's the only historian I've ever met who never wants to talk about his book. But he's written about how the situation in Iraq, Nigeria, Sudan, Myanmar, Hong Kong, and other places, the instability, and Kashmir, all goes back to the British Empire and what we did there. I mean, in Kashmir, I'm simplifying it, basically it's a Muslim majority state that the British then sold to a tyrannical Hindu monarch. And obviously it was going to result in war. Look at Israel-Palestine, very complicated reasons for that particular dispute, but essentially the British were in charge of that part of the world, and in some very unprofessional correspondence, they promised it at the same time to the Zionist Jews and also to the Arabs.
Oh.
And at the time, people were saying the only consequence of this is going to be war. And then in Iraq, we decided to install this disastrous Hashemite monarchy randomly, because in Burma we were doing that. We got rid of a monarchy. So there was no consistency to British imperial policies, but the only consistent consequence was chaos. And so in Iraq, what that created, that monarchy, was a sense of, revolution, a desire to get rid of the monarchy. That created the conditions for Saddam Hussein. And then 100 years later, we're fighting Saddam Hussein. And I don't remember a single article during the Iraq War where the British acknowledged that we'd helped to create that situation. And similar in Myanmar, we definitely created the situation for the current leaders. And also the way in which we classed ethnicities in Myanmar has led to the atrocities we've seen there. And so the legacies are profound and continue to shape people's lives today.
Quite a sobering thought to finish on. But just before we hand over to the audience for questions, you wrote a book called Empire Land, which looked at the influence of the empire on Britain. You've just written Empireworld that we've just been discussing. Where to next?
Well, people often joke, I'm going to write a book about how the British Empire has influenced space. Empireverse next. But actually, it's a very short book, but there is something that happened in space. Because, the British loved naming places after the places they'd just come from. It's such a bizarre thing that you would leave Plymouth and then name the place you arrived at Plymouth. It just reveals a fundamental lack of imagination, right? But it happened in space. That William Herschel, the man who discovered Uranus from Bath, the city of Bath in London, he named the planet originally after King George. There's so many places called Georgetown because of King George. He called it Georgium Sidus. It's a Latin name, and it didn't go down well with the rest of the world for obvious reasons. And eventually it changed its name to Uranus, but I think it was a Greek god. So that would be my book about Empireverse. But a very short book.
It might be a little shorter.
Quite short.
A few shorter footnotes.
But I'm writing a kid's version of Empireworld, and then I'm taking a break from Empire for a while.
Okay.
Because everyone's had enough.
Okay.
Not at least me.
So, let's open it up to questions. I suspect there will be a few. The lady at the front.
Oh, no one ever wants to ask the first question, but thank you.
This lady does. Is there a microphone?
Microphone is coming. Either microphone or... Yes, a microphone is coming.
Quick, please. Microphone.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you. Is it working?
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you very much. My parents taught me that the British had a business of divide and rule, that they would divide cultures so they'd fight.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, sorry, which nationality are you?
I'm Australian.
So I can pick on you.
But I've got
Australian.
English, sadly, as my background.
No reason to be ashamed. Divide and rule. I mean, I am an illustration of that. I am Sikh, that's why I wear this. I used to have a turban and all that beard. And the Sikhs are an example of that, in that the British decided that the Sikhs were a warrior race. It goes back to that weird racial science. And they decided the Sikhs were physically equipped to be warriors. As you can see from my physique, that is not true. You could probably beat me in a fight. But it was largely because the Sikhs took the side of the British in the 1857 mutiny. And they did the same for loads of other groups, random groups around the world, the Hausas in Nigeria, the Highlanders in Scotland. And they decided that, the Sikhs, even today, account for a large portion of the Indian army. And we see ourselves through that prism. So that policy of divide and rule continues to divide India, even in the modern day. But I see it in my life in that my trolls are very vocal. They're not always British people. I've got my most vociferous troll who comes to most of my events, but I think won't be here today because it's too expensive. He's Sri Lankan. And I think that a lot of that goes down to the fact that the British indulged certain ethnic groups and gave them privileges. And so those groups tend to think very fondly of the British Empire. One of the most annoying monuments in London can be found in Regent's Park. And there's a water fountain there, which has been paid for by a Parsi gentleman, which is how he describes himself, and to thank the British for what they did in India. And it turns out the Parsis were one of the groups that the Indians gave lots of privileges to. So, yeah, divide and rule was a consistent policy and a very successful one for the British, and it continues today.
Over there in the corner.
Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah. That microphone is going to have to grow wings.
Were there important differences between
Australian?
Were there important
So are you Australian or American? I can't work out your accent.
American.
American, okay.
Were there important differences between how the British and how the Dutch integrated and remarried into their colonized people?
I don't know enough about the Dutch system, but I can talk about, I suspect there are a lot of similarities. And this is one of the contradictions about the British Empire, in that it became a very racist empire. And by the late 19th century, it was frowned upon to be British and to marry an Indian person. It was frowned upon to socialize with them. British people, as you probably know, had their own clubs. They didn't like to employ even Anglo-Asians in certain positions. But when the British first arrived in India, and William Dalrymple has written about this beautifully in his books, they didn't have those racist ideas. And a lot of East India Company officials married Indian wives. A huge number of them had Anglo-Asian children. A lot of wills in that period of empire left property to Anglo-Asian children. But then it became almost routine to not leave things to your own children. And this Anglo-Asian community became ostracized on two fronts, by the British and by the Indians. And so found themselves in a horrible predicament. But I don't know a huge amount about the Dutch, but I suspect something very similar happened.
It was the same pattern.
Yeah.
What I've read. Yeah.
Yeah. And similar things happened, obviously, in America. Another great British colony, although Americans don't like to talk about that. Thank you.
Lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Coralie Dimitriadis. I'm from Australia, but my parents are from Cyprus, and I spend a lot of time in Cyprus.
Cyprus also
Yes, this is my
fucked
question.
up by the British.
Yeah, so I'm an author, I write fiction and non-fiction and poetry. My question is we don't really hear a lot about Cyprus in the media in terms of how the English gave us our independence in 1960 on the condition that they retained 3% of our land, which they use today as military bases to undertake their war efforts in the Middle East. And actually, the Iran missiles that were intercepted, the interceptors came from Cyprus. The majority of Cypriots, they do not want the military bases on these lands. And we don't really hear about this a lot in the media, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, no, I've been actually looking into Cyprus because, another great British imperial legacy, George Michael. He would not have ended up in Britain because his father was Greek Cypriot and had his village was wiped out because essentially it was partition, wasn't it? It's more complicated because of Turkey involved, but
No, it wasn't partition. Well, a lot of people think that the English set it up. So, because one of the other conditions that they put on us was that Turkey, England, and Greece always remain guarantors on the island, which means if there was ever any civil unrest, they had permission to invade, which is what they did. And then they came, Turkey, and have been illegally occupying since 1974. So while that partition is pretty stable at the moment, most Cypriots, their concern is, what's happening in the Middle East and how they're being exploited. Their land is being exploited because of this colonial agreement that we don't want anymore.
yeah, I mean, you saw that as well in the recent issue with the Chagos Islands. I don't know if any of you have been following in the news, but basically the Britain has finally given the Chagos Islands back to the people who were there, and it revolves around a military base. So you've got this network of military bases which wouldn't be there if it weren't for the British Empire, but also tax avoidance. We've got an international arrangement of colonies former colonies where you can escape paying tax, which all goes back to the British Empire. Now places like Bermuda and so on. So you've got these kind of invisible international systems which go back to the days of empire. But yeah, I mean, the situation in the Middle East, very, very complicated. But Israel, people ask me all the time, you talk about colonialism, and is what's happening in Israel an clear example of colonialism? And I think it is, and it isn't, because, for example, it's often said that the Israelis are behaving like colonial settlers, and absolutely some of them are. Some of the right-wing Israeli politicians talk in those terms. You see land being taken away from Palestinians, but equally, a lot of the Jews who arrived in Israel in the 1940s, all of them came as the victims of a genocide. And it's an example of how opposite things can be true at the same time. And it's often said that the Israelis are behaving like white supremacists, like the British will behave like white supremacists. Again, it's true. This is the way some Israeli politicians talk about Palestinians being animals. But equally, a lot of the people who arrived in the 1940s arrived as the victims of a genocide, and the Nazis did not think the Jews were white. They're the ultimate illustration of how Jews weren't considered white. And opposite things can be true at the same time. But what I've just said is something you can't easily say on social media or in politics. I would be shot down by people on both sides. And there's not an appetite for nuance because the situation is so explosive there, and there's so much anger and violence that people don't want nuance. But the only way that situation is going to ever be solved is through nuance and recognizing the grievances of both sides.
Well said.
Sorry, long answer. Big subject.
Front row. Front row, please.
Hi, Australian here. If you want to sling some post-colonial at me, it's fine. My question is about whether the very idea of national borders and using that still as a definition of where colonialism is coming from is still relevant, or whether that is actually now a disguise for the new systems of power which seem to be the accretion of wealth to people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and the Murdochs in particular, obviously, whether we're looking in the wrong place for where our doom is coming from and whether that can be described in colonial terms.
That's a very perceptive thing to say. And I would say actually national borders, a lot of them go back to empire, and a lot of these countries wouldn't exist if Nigeria's very square borders created. So many countries in Africa just are actually colonial creations. Pakistan, Sierra Leone, Australia, all these places would not exist if it wasn't for empire. But you're right, and there's all these academics looking at, say, the way tech companies work. Again, William Dalrymple's written about, in the Anarchy's book, about how the way Amazon and Microsoft work, these big tech companies, is very much how the East India Company worked, in that they're very keen on monopolies. They're hugely international, and we've got to remember that the Dutch East India Company, they were companies, very strange companies, because the East India Company had an army twice the size of the British Army, and at the moment Amazon doesn't have that, but he has a lot of vans, and
and they're not democracies, and that concerns me hugely too, that we're not looking at that power structure and asking how is that democratic, because it is the new power.
Yeah, and you see the way Elon Musk is trying to influence elections around the world, throwing money at US voters to vote a certain way. Absolutely, I think you could say these are neo-colonial structures. And even agencies like the United Nations, itself based on the League of Nations, which was explicitly based on the British Empire. These structures have connections to that time. And you could argue that the way China is buying up influence in Sri Lanka and Africa and so on is also neo-colonial, in that it's copying what the European colonizers did. So yeah, it is an interesting model.
The gentleman in the middle there.
Oh, we're going for the front? Oh no, we're going to the middle. Actually,
Gentleman in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, there we go. I'm from Australia. We're not racist in Australia. We recognised Aboriginal people in 1967, and we treated them more than dogs in 1967, but we don't want to listen to them because we had a referendum last year.
Yeah, I
and
heard about that.
60% of people voted it down. So I just want to tell anybody from Australia, from all those other people who come from other places, Australians are not racist, okay?
Yeah, let's. Yeah,
The mere fact that we don't want to listen to people who've been there 40,000 years is just bypassing.
and let's ignore the white Australia policy.
What was that again? But I'm interested in your comments about the indenture system. And from what I've read on the indenture system, there seemed to be a view in the British Parliament about what it meant, and there seemed to be a view in the colonies about what it meant and the way it was applied. Do you want to talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things when you go to entire societies created by indentured labour, like Mauritius, where I went to research it, is that when you ask people there about their ancestors, they often don't talk about indenture, they talk about slavery. They're like, oh, when my ancestors came as slaves. And I'm like, no, that's literally another system. But it's so poorly understood even by the descendants of the systems. And I think it was also really interesting how the way indenture progressed, one of the main critics of the system were the British. And we forget this is one of the main contradictions, in that whatever imperial policy Britain had, there were people in Britain opposing it. And the people who got rid of abolition were so on it with indenture because they were worried that we were creating a new system of slavery. So from day one, when John Gladstone came up with the system of indenture, the father of William Gladstone, the 4 times Prime Minister of Britain, there were people from Britain visiting these colonies, writing endless reports, explaining how people were being exploited. And that is, I think, is the most important contrast, in that the criticism often didn't come from the indentured people themselves because they didn't have the power. It came from anti-imperial British people. And I would say, if you want to talk about what it means to be British, yeah, definitely being proud of being imperial is a British tradition, but opposing empire is just as proud a British tradition. And some of the most famous people we've had in our British history have opposed empire. George Orwell, William Gladstone, and it's part of who we are. And the freedom of speech is a really proud British imperial legacy. So when people try to shout people like me and possibly you down for having the views that we do, I say, actually, my views are just as British as yours. And it's the fact that my views are tolerated that makes me British and us British. So don't try to shut me down.
Yep.
Hi, I'm not Australian,
Oh,
That's refreshing.
what are you then?
but I come from a great colonizing power and I'm not proud of it. I'm from France. In France, there is a big movement to promote the French language in Africa, especially West Africa and the whole Francophone area. I wanted you to speak a little bit about the legacy of the English language around the world. Is that positive point or negative point?
Yes, we're sitting next to someone who worked for the British Council.
Yes,
I guess, is that part of a policy to promote the English language?
certainly.
Yeah, and I have complicated feelings about that because, as everything I think is complicated, but in the English language, in many ways, has been a positive thing in that it has brought people together. Sometimes in nations where there were hundreds of languages, in India, in Nigeria, it's a common ground that allows people to communicate. But equally, it also involved the repression of other languages and indigenous cultures. And I note that in India, there's a huge anti-English movement. And India obviously embraced the English language almost like no one else. But you very rarely hear Modi speaking English, so he can. And that is part of his appeal, in that he's always speaking, even when he goes abroad, he doesn't speak in English, does he? I don't think I've ever seen.
Translator.
Yeah. And it's a way for him to say, I am the first properly Indian leader. All the others that came before me were educated in the British system, and often they went to Oxbridge, and they were colonial, whereas I am truly Indian. And you can see how that's a successful technique. But equally, in part of his decolonization in India, I don't see him, he's kind of getting rid of English. It's still a big part of the culture there. But he is trying to introduce medical degrees in non-English languages, which is annoying a lot of people because a lot of medical terms don't exist in Hindi. So it's very complicated. But I can see the argument. It's about restoring the dignity of certain cultures that have been repressed because of colonialism.
Yeah.
So I can definitely see the contradictory legacies there.
Great. I'm afraid on that note we're going to have to stop. I was told 4 minutes ago that our time was over, so I've overrun already. But thank you all very much.
Oh, there's a woman insisting on one question.
No, I don't think I can
okay.
because we're 4 minutes over already.
And there's another session.
Yeah, and there's another session. Thank you all for helping us to warm up the Alang Alang stage this morning. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Sathnam. And
Thank you
to you all.